Jung unearthed something most therapists are too afraid to admit. Before any real awakening can occur, certain things need to vanish from your life, not voluntarily, not because you decided it, but because your psyche begins to shed everything that's blocking your transformation. And when you understand what these 7 things are, you stop resisting the process and start collaborating with it. Neuroscience in 2025 confirmed what Jung intuited a century ago. The brain undergoes a structural reorganization during profound identity shifts. Researchers at Stanford University have documented that periods of existential crisis are associated with changes in the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network. In other words, your brain literally reconfigures itself before you become who you really are. But here's what no one tells you. This reconfiguration isn't smooth. It begins with losses. Things you thought were part of you simply disappear. And if you don't understand what's happening, you panic. You try to reclaim what was lost. And by doing so, you interrupt the awakening process. If you've been through, or are currently going through, a period where everything seems to be falling apart, if friendships that lasted for years have suddenly lost their meaning, if things that once gave you pleasure no longer matter, if you look at your life and no longer recognize yourself in it. This video was made specifically for you. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal the 7 things that disappear before true awakening. I'll show you why each of them needs to go. I'll connect Jung's deep psychology with the latest neuroscience on identity transformation. And I'll give you something no conventional therapist can offer: the understanding that what seems like destruction is actually construction. What seems like loss is actually gain. What seems like the end is actually the beginning. But before we start with the 7 things, you need to understand a fundamental concept from Jung: individuation. Jung defined individuation as the process by which a person becomes who they truly are. Not what their family wanted them to be, not what society expects, not what they've learned to pretend to be, but their authentic essence, what Jung called the self, the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, united. And Jung was very clear about one thing most people don't want to hear. Individuation isn't addition, it's subtraction. You don't become who you are by accumulating things, experiences, knowledge. You become who you are by losing everything that you are not, shedding layers of falsehood, abandoning masks you've carried your whole life. He wrote that on the path of individuation. A person must abandon everything that doesn't truly belong to them, and this abandonment is rarely voluntary. It's usually forced by life, by crises, by losses that seem unfair, but are surgically precise. Life knows exactly what you need to lose, even when you don't. And here's where neuroscience offers a fascinating perspective. Andrew Huberman, in his episodes on brain plasticity, explained that the adult brain only undergoes significant reorganization under 2 conditions: intense focused attention or intense emotional states. And that's exactly what happens during existential crises. The brain is flooded with neurochemicals that allow change. The pain of loss paradoxically creates the neurological conditions for transformation. Now, let's get to the 7 things that disappear. The first thing that disappears is the persona. Jung defined persona as the mask we wear to function in society. The term comes from Latin and originally meant the mask worn by actors in the Roman theater. And that's exactly what it is: a performance, a role we play for others. The persona isn't false in the sense of deliberate lying. It's a necessary adaptation. You have a persona for work, one for family, one for friends, different masks for different contexts, and to a certain extent, this is healthy. It's necessary to function in society. The problem is when you identify completely with the persona, when you forget that the mask isn't you, when you believe that you are the successful professional, or the dedicated mom, or the fun friend, and nothing more beyond that. When the mask fuses with the face, when you no longer know where the role ends and you begin. Jung warned that this identification is extremely dangerous. He said that a man cannot rid himself in favor of an artificial personality without suffering consequences. The attempt to do this is always an act of violence against one's own nature, and sooner or later, nature takes revenge. Before the awakening, the persona begins to disintegrate. You can no longer maintain the masks. The effort of seeming who you aren't becomes unbearable. And then something strange happens. You start acting in ways you yourself don't understand. Say things you'd never say before. Make choices that shock the people around you. Lose control of the image you've carefully built for years. Neuroscience explains this in a fascinating way. Maintaining the persona requires constant cognitive energy. The prefrontal cortex needs to work continuously to monitor and adjust your behavior, to suppress authentic impulses, to keep the performance convincing. When the brain is undergoing reorganization, that energy is no longer available. The mask falls because the system simply can't sustain it anymore. Researchers have found that people in states of chronic stress or existential crisis show a reduction in the activity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is exactly the region responsible for controlling social behavior. When it fails, authenticity forces its way through, not as a choice, but as a neurological necessity. Jung saw this happen with countless patients. Respectable people who suddenly did scandalous things, controlled people who exploded in anger, pleasant people who became brutally honest. And he understood that this wasn't collapse, it was emergence. The true self forcing its way through the layers of falsehood. The self destroying the prison of the persona. The second thing that disappears is friend. Not all friends, but those friends who were connected to your persona, those who liked your mask, those who related to who you pretended to be, and not who you really are. This is brutal. It's one of the most painful losses in the awakening process, because it often includes people you've known for years, people with whom you've shared important moments, people you genuinely thought would be in your life forever, people you loved, and who you thought loved you. But here's a truth, one that Jung uncovered and that can be quite unsettling. Many relationships are between personas, not between people. Your mask interacts with the other person's mask, and as long as both masks remain stable, the relationship functions smoothly. But when one mask starts to disintegrate, the relationship loses its foundation. When your persona starts to crumble, these friendships reveal their true nature. You can no longer be who they expect you to be. They can't accept who you're becoming. And then, there's either a natural drifting apart, or a dramatic breakup, or even worse, a silent fading away that's never explained. One day, you realize that certain people simply aren't there anymore. Jung observed that. During individuation, the person becomes intolerable to those who aren't on the same path. He wrote that the individuating person becomes a stranger to their own tribe, not because they've changed for the worse, but because they've changed to be closer to themselves, and that's threatening to those who still live behind masks. Your authenticity is a mirror, showing them their own masks, and most people don't want to see that. Neuroscience confirms this pattern. Researchers studying social networks have discovered that we maintain friendships through predictable patterns of behavior. Neural synchronization, unconscious mimicry, predictability of response. When these patterns change drastically, the social brain of others registers incongruence. And incongruence generates discomfort. And discomfort generates distancing. Their brain literally pulls them away from you because you've become unpredictable. So, if you're losing friends during your awakening process, it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. It might mean you're doing something very right, something so right that the false connections can no longer survive, something so authentic that the relationships based on masks can't continue. Jung offered a comforting perspective on this. He said that the friends you lose in the process of individuation will be replaced by deeper connections, people who relate to yourself, not your persona, people who love who you really are, not who you pretended to be. These connections are rarer, but they are real. The third thing that disappears is the interest in superficial things. Hobbies that you loved lose their appeal. Entertainment that used to distract you feels empty. Conversations about trivial subjects become unbearable. News, gossip, trends, all of it loses relevance. You look at the things that used to occupy your time, and you think, why was I spending my life on this? Why did I think this mattered? This change is disorienting, because the things that are disappearing weren't necessarily bad. They were normal. They were what everyone does. Watching shows, following celebrities, arguing about politics, buying things, attending social events. None of that is wrong in itself, but suddenly, none of it seems sufficient. Jung called this the withdrawal of libido. The psychic energy that was invested in external activities starts to turn inward. It's not depression in the clinical sense. It's a profound reorientation of where your vital energy is being directed. The libido that once flowed outward now flows inward, and in there, it finds something much more interesting than any external entertainment could offer. Neuroscience describes a similar phenomenon through the reward system. During periods of cerebral reorganization, the dopaminergic system recalibrates. Activities that once released dopamine stop working, not because something is wrong with you, but because your brain is raising the threshold of what is significant. It's preparing to find satisfaction on deeper levels. Andrew Huberman explained on his podcasts that dopamine isn't about pleasure. It's about motivation and seeking. When the reward system recalibrates, you stop being motivated by the same things. What once seemed valuable now seems trivial. What once seemed important now seems irrelevant. This isn't apathy. It's discernment. Your brain is learning to distinguish between what really matters and what was just distraction. This explains why people in the process of awakening frequently seem to have lost interest in everything. They haven't lost interest. They've lost interest in the superficial. The energy is being reserved for the profound. But because the profound hasn't yet fully emerged, they're stuck in a strange limbo, neither satisfied with the old nor connected with the new. And this limbo can last months or even years. Jung advised patience in these moments. He said that the libido, withdrawn from the external world, needs time to find its new object, and that new object, invariably, is the self, the totality of who you really are. When the libido finally finds the self, a new form of interest emerges, an interest in depth, in meaning, in truth. And that interest is much more satisfying than any external distraction ever was. The fourth thing that disappears is the tolerance for falsehood. You can no longer play politics. You can no longer smile when you don't want to. You can no longer agree with things that you disagree with. The ability to swallow frogs simply disappears. And this creates serious problems in your social and professional life. Things that you used to do automatically now become impossible. Praising something that you think is bad, agreeing with opinions that you consider absurd, participating in empty conversations just to be polite, pretending interest in people who irritate you, maintaining relationships that you know are toxic. All of this becomes unbearable. Jung identified this as the weakening of the ego's adaptation function. The healthy ego knows when to bend, knows when to fake it, knows when to sacrifice authenticity for convenience. It's a function of social survival. But when individuation begins, the self that is emerging doesn't accept these compromises. It demands truth, and that demand is relentless. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't make concessions. Jung wrote about this directly. He said that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering, and that much of the legitimate suffering comes exactly from having to live in disagreement with oneself. When the self begins to emerge, that suffering of falsehood becomes intolerable. The neurosis that was keeping everything in place begins to fail, and the truth forces its way through. Neuroscience shows that the intolerance for falsehood is connected to changes in the anterior insula. This region of the brain processes dissonance between what we feel internally and what we express externally. During periods of profound transformation, the insula becomes hypersensitive to this dissonance. The falsehood that was once tolerable becomes physically uncomfortable. You feel it in your body when you're being fake, a malaise that doesn't go away until you speak the truth. This explains why people undergoing an awakening often sabotage their own careers or relationships. They're not being self-destructive. They're being compelled by an internal force that no longer accepts the lie, even when the lie would be convenient, even when the truth comes at a high cost. The body simply refuses to participate in the falsehood. Carl Jung warned that this period is dangerous because society functions with a certain amount of lubricating falsity, social lies that facilitate coexistence, and whoever refuses to participate in this game is seen as a problem, as inadequate, as difficult. But he also said that this period is necessary, because without going through this intolerance, you'll never arrive at true authenticity. The pain of being seen as difficult is the price of integrity. The fifth thing that disappears is the need for approval. For most of your life, you've probably sought external approval. From your parents first, then from teachers, from bosses, from friends, from romantic partners, from social media. This search is so automatic that most people don't even realize they're doing it, but it consumes an enormous amount of psychic energy and shapes practically all of your decisions. Think about this honestly. How many choices have you made in life based on what others would think, what clothes to wear, what career to pursue, what opinion to express, guys, who to date? The list is endless, and most of these choices weren't conscious. They were automatic, your brain constantly calculating how to maximize approval and minimize rejection before the awakening. This need starts to weaken. In the beginning, it's disconcerting. You do something and expect the reaction of others, and when it comes, positive or negative, you realize it doesn't matter as much as it used to. And when it doesn't come, you realize you're not missing it. It's strange, as if background noise that existed your whole life suddenly stops. Carl Jung described this as the shift of the center of personality, from the ego to the self. The ego needs approval, because the ego is defined in relation to others. The self doesn't need approval, because the self is defined in relation to itself. When the center starts to shift, the dependence on external validation decreases naturally. It's not effort, it's not discipline, it's a structural change in the way you relate to yourself. Neuroscience has identified the neural basis of this process, the social monitoring system, which involves the anterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, undergoes changes during transformations of identity. Activation in response to social judgment decreases, not because the person has become insensitive, but because the source of self-worth is changing location from external to internal. Andrew Huberman explained that the brain literally rebuilds the evaluation circuits during periods of transformation. What was previously processed as an existential threat, being rejected by the group, is now processed as neutral information, not because you're in denial, but because your system of reference has changed. You no longer need the group to know who you are. This is liberating, but also scary, because without the need for approval, you lose a navigation system that you've used your whole life. You no longer know what to do, because you always knew what to do, based on what others expected. Now you need to discover what you want, and that requires a level of self-knowledge that most people have never developed. Discovering your own desires, when you've spent your life following the desires of others, is a Herculean task. The sixth thing that disappears is the narrative you had about your life. We all have a story that we tell about ourselves. A narrative that explains how we got here. I am this way because of that. This happened to me. So I became this. My parents did that. So I am this way. Trauma X caused behavior, Y. This narrative gives meaning to the chaos of experience. It organizes the past into a line that leads to the present. This story is fundamental to identity. When someone asks who you are, the answer is basically your narrative, summarized. And you tell this story so many times that it seems solid, objective, true. You forget that it's a selection, an interpretation, a construction. But before the awakening, this narrative starts to crumble. You look at your story and realize it no longer holds up. Shut that you selected certain events and ignored others, that you interpreted things in a way that protected your ego, that the story you told was a convenient fiction, a fiction that made you look like a hero or a victim, but never responsible. Carl Jung called this the confrontation with the narrative shadow. Not just the repressed aspects of personality, but the repressed versions of your own story, the events you'd prefer to forget, the choices you don't want to admit, the times when you were the villain, not the victim, the parts of the story that don't fit into the heroic or victimized version that you tell of yourself. Neuroscience shows that our personal narratives are built and maintained by the default mode network. This network connects emotional memories with a sense of identity. It becomes active when you're not doing anything, when you're daydreaming. And what it does is retell your story to yourself, reinforce the narrative, keep the fiction cohesive. During brain reorganization, this network undergoes significant alterations. The story that seemed solid starts to seem fluid, mutable, questionable. Memories that seemed certain reveal gaps. Interpretations that seemed obvious reveal alternatives. The narrative you've told for decades suddenly seems like one story among many possible. This is profoundly disorienting. Because your story is part of who you believe you are, when it crumbles, you lose your footing. You no longer know who you are, because the narrative that defined your identity no longer works. It's like waking up from a dream and realizing that the dream was the only thing you knew. But Carl Jung saw this as an opportunity, the opportunity to build a more truthful narrative, one that includes the shadow, one that accepts complexity, one that doesn't need heroes or villains to make sense, a story that recognizes your participation in everything that happened. And that gives you power over the future, precisely by accepting responsibility for the past. The seventh thing that disappears is the fear of death. This may seem too dramatic or too mystical, but Jung was very clear about this. Individuation is a process of symbolic death and rebirth. The ego, as you know it, needs to die so that the self can be born. And before this symbolic death happens completely, the fear of physical death starts to lose its power. It doesn't mean you become reckless. It doesn't mean you ignore danger. It doesn't mean you seek death. It means that death ceases to be the absolute terror it once was. It becomes part of the cycle, part of the process. Something you can contemplate without being paralyzed by fear. Something you can look at straight on. Jung connected this to the concept of conjunctio, the union of opposites, life and death, ego and shadow, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and darkness. When these opposites begin to integrate, the fear that came from separation diminishes. You're no longer fighting against death. You're including it in the totality of experience. It's no longer the enemy. It's part of who you are. Neuroscience has studied people who have gone through profound transformative experiences, near-death experiences, supervised psychedelic experiences, spontaneous mystical experiences. What researchers find is a consistent reduction in the fear of death. The brain structures associated with existential fear show less reactivity. It's not that these people don't recognize mortality. It's that they've developed a different relationship with it, Jung wrote that the second half of life should be dedicated to preparing for death, not in a morbid way, but in a way that allows you to live more fully. Because when you're no longer afraid of the end, you stop postponing what matters. You stop saving your life for later. You start living now. Each moment becomes more precious, exactly because you know it's finite. Now that you know the 7 things that disappear, you need to understand something crucial. This process is not linear. It's not clean. And it's not easy. You might lose the persona, and then try to rebuild it. You might lose friends, and then try to win them back. You might regain interest in superficial things as a form of escape. You might go back to seeking approval when the loneliness bites. You might reconstruct your old narrative when the uncertainty is too much. You might be afraid of death again when reality hits. That doesn't mean you failed. It means that the process is spiral, not circular. You go through the same point several times, but each time at a different level. Each passage is deeper. Each loss is more complete. And each time something more falls away. And with each loss, you become more you. So Jung advised that the most important thing is not to resist. When something is being taken from you, don't cling to it tooth and nail. Ask what this loss is trying to show me. What this thing I'm losing was hiding from me. What will emerge in the space it leaves, because the space that remains when these things disappear isn't empty. It's possibility. It's the ground where the self will build something new, something more authentic, something more aligned with who you really are. Neuroscience calls this neuroplasticity. The brain reorganizes itself in response to experience, and experiences of significant loss create the conditions for profound reorganization. The old connections weaken, new connections form, and what emerges is a different system, more integrated, more flexible, more capable of dealing with the complexity of existence. Jung would call this the birth of the self, the moment when you stop being defined by what you've lost and start being defined by what you've discovered within yourself, the moment when individuation ceases to be a process and becomes realization. So, what do you do with this information? How do you navigate this period of losses without being destroyed by them? First, you stop fighting. If things are disappearing from your life, and it's aligned with the 7 signs I described, it's probably the awakening beginning. Fighting against it only prolongs the suffering. Resistance doesn't prevent the process. It only makes it more painful. Second, you find adequate support. Not just any support. Support from people who understand the process, who won't try to convince you to go back to normal, who won't pathologize your transformation. Jungian therapists, process groups, or simply people who've gone through the same thing, and can tell you what to expect on the other side. Third, you practice what Jung called enduring the tension of opposites. You hold the pain of loss without trying to resolve it too quickly. You allow the emptiness to exist. Without filling it with cheap substitutions, you tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing who you're becoming. This requires strength, but it's a strength that develops exactly by being exercised. Fourth, you document the process. Jung kept his famous Red Book during his years of confrontation with the unconscious. You don't have to create a work of art, but writing down dreams, thoughts, images can help to integrate what's happening. It can create a map of a territory without maps. Fifth, you cultivate patience. The awakening has no deadline. It doesn't happen when you want it to. It happens when it's ready. And being ready often means having lost everything you needed to lose, not before. Jung said something that sums it all up. He said that there's no transformation without destruction. That to be born again, something must die first. And that the courage needed isn't the courage to fight, but the courage to let go. If you're in the middle of this process, if things are disappearing from your life, if you look around and almost don't recognize your existence anymore, know that this may be exactly what needs to happen, the destruction that precedes creation. the death that precedes rebirth, the emptiness that precedes fullness. And on the other side of this process, what awaits isn't an improved version of who you were. It's someone completely different. Someone you don't yet know, but someone you've always been. Beneath all the masks, beneath all the fears, beneath everything that needed to disappear, so that you could finally appear. If you've made it this far, if you recognized yourself in these words, if you felt that someone has finally explained what you're going through, I want to ask you a favor. YouTube has that gold heart below the video, the super thanks. When you click it, you're saying, I'm in the process. Things are disappearing from my life. And now I understand why. Each super thanks is a declaration that you've chosen the awakening, even knowing that it comes at a price. And that's exactly what Jung admired, the courage to lose what needs to be lost, to gain what deserves to be gained. Now I have a question for you, and I really want you to answer in the comments. Jung mapped these 7 things that disappear before the awakening. Which one is fading from your life right now? The persona, your friends, your interest in superficial things, tolerance for falsehood, the need for approval, the narrative you tell yourself about your life, even the fear of death. Choose one, or more than one, and share your experience. What has it been like to lose it? What have you discovered in the space that's left behind? What do you feel is emerging? Because when you write your story, something shifts. The process that once felt so lonely becomes shared. And maybe, just maybe, someone reading your comment will realize one day they are not alone. That other people are losing the same things. That this awakening, even though it's deeply individual, is also collective. And in that recognition, something completes itself. What was being lost gains meaning. The emptiness finds purpose. And the transformation that seemed like destruction reveals its true name, birth. Carl Jung knew this path isn't for everyone. Most people prefer to maintain their masks, their persona, their superficial friendships, their shallow interests, their need for validation, their comfortable narrative, their fear of the unknown. And that's not wrong. It's a valid choice. Not everyone needs to awaken. Not everyone wants to. But if you're here, watching this video, you're probably not the majority. You likely feel that something bigger is calling you. Something that demands you lose what you thought you were to discover who you really are. Something that both scares you and draws you in. At the same time, something you can't ignore, even when you try. Welcome to the awakening. Welcome to the loss that is gain. Welcome to the death that is birth. Welcome to yourself. As Andrew Huberman from Stanford University often points out, true growth often comes from pushing through discomfort and embracing change.